Okay, so hello, my name is Mikolaj, and I will talk to you about the very similar method associated topic to the previous one, but focusing this time on the bulk and net sediment transport in the Gulf of Riga. So, as for the bit of introduction why this research is even being done as part of my PhD, is to quantify and recalculate the sediment transport rates and find the divergence-convergence cells to compare against the previous study that was quite a while back now, from 2014, this particular figure, which has been done at a resolution of about 5.5 kilometers, which, while good to get the overall trends, it's not sufficient enough to analyze the finer scale features of longshore sediment transport. Now, regarding the methods, the background wave model that was used for the calculations is the aforementioned SWAN model, which the accurate setup of is already described a bit further with two published papers that I have linked here, one already fully published and the other was recently accepted into Oceanologia that focuses more about the variability in the climate of Gulf of Riga. Now, when it comes to the grid system that we've used in the wave model, as it serves as the basis for the longshore sediment transport one, it uses the resolution of up to 560 meters after setting up a triple nest system, the main running the entire Baltic, the second level running the entire Gulf of Riga, and the finest that I have put very scientific numbers on 1, 2, 3, 4 are the 4 subgrids that I have selected in order to start my recalculation. Now, how the wave data point selection works is essentially I look at the storm values or the top 5% of wave heights, which I usually then compare against what is the known beach closure at that location in order to select suitable point of all the wave values. And later on the sediment transport is calculated along the selected grid points. This here is the 1 nautical mile grid that we have for the entire Gulf of Riga, while I focused on with the further results on the smaller ones. Regarding the methods, you have already seen this slide. You already know what this is all about. But just as a reminder, we utilize the CERC method from the Coastal Engineering Research Council, which gives us the potential for longshore sediment transport. And based on the wave parameters, which I mainly take from SWAN, the wave direction and the wave height, then placed against the angle set at the relevant coastline. But as it was slightly hinted with a question, there is one method limitation for this, which is sediment availability. As for the entire coastline, the model runs on the assumption of availability of fine-grained sediments, which will not be the case when going, for example, to the coastline of southern Estonia, where we will have mainly larger pebbles or rocky shorelines. And the potential transport for finer sediments will tell us that there is a potential for sediments to be moved there, but not that it exactly exists in reality. That's the aspect of this particular research. And this figure you also already seen, because we are duplicating this session, it seems. But it is a general guideline for how to read the net transport figures developed by Viska, that when you are standing on the coastline and looking out to the water, anything in the positives moves to your right, anything in the negatives moves to your left. The line crosses upwards, then it's a point of erosion. If it goes downwards, it's a point of accumulation. And that's the more or less summary guideline of how to look at the net transport figures. Now, when it comes to, I sub-selected 2 of my subgrids in order to keep within the time limits. And I have taken the Roja grid, which goes more or less from Kolka Cape until the harbor of Engure. In this one, this is the bulk transport measures. We can see that there is a significant decrease after passing the Kolka Cape, which is what matches the previous studies in that area, as well as there is a relatively stable amount of bulk potential transport going along the coastline south of Kolka Cape, with a noticeable decrease, for example, by Merstrax, where we know that there is pretty much almost a halt of sediment transport. But when it comes to the net transport, the figure is slightly different, as it now gives us a little bit more in terms of direction or the points of erosion accumulation. Around the Kolka Cape is one of the most significantly noticeable, just after 20 points drop in sediment, not drop, but the point of erosion of sediment transport, which is where usually the famous pictures come from that have fallen trees because of the sand being washed away just around the Kolka Cape. And further along there is a point where the sediment transport stops before the point of port of Roja, as well as another one where the coastline angle shifts to a certain barrier for longshore sediment transport just around Merstrax area, after which it continues relatively in a continuous manner along the coastline. And the secondary one that I decided to take is the Pärnu Bay, which, and this one, please excuse the numbering going in reverse, because it was the first grid I selected, and I selected in the opposite order to all my other grids. But in this particular case, we have the range from Kabli in the south going to Hobesalu and the western coastlines of Estonia. And in here, the main feature of it is that sediment transport slows down going to into Pärnu Bay, where following the longest waves usually that can even enter the bay from the south to southwestern direction, makes sense as it making it final destination for all the bulk transport and net transport, meaning that there is very little moving longshore in the Pärnu Bay itself. After Pärnu and going to the west, there is an increase to ridiculous values of bulk potential sediment transport, but this is why I wanted to keep it as a natural limitation to show the limitation of the model itself, because when it comes to incorporating sediment availability in the southern coastlines of Estonia, there isn't that much fine sediment. In fact, it's mainly rocky shores and large pebbles, meaning that fine-grade sediment model will give you results, but they actually don't contribute as much as we want them to. Just tell us that the wave climate could put a lot of sand moving if we dumped a lot of sand there. And when it comes to the net transport, a similar pattern can be seen when the transport is relatively continuous along the coastline towards Pärnu, going from the south, after which the pattern more or less reverses in the center of the Pärnu Bay, leading towards the position in that area. And further along, there is one other feature that can be easily noted with certain points of reversals to the west of Pärnu, which I have put also in one more figure that I have decided to abridge the more or less findings that I have. So, the significant trends that can be observed in the final resolution study that I have been doing so far is that to the west of Kolka Cape there is very large potential transport and very large known amount of transport happening in that area that more or less slows down and around Kolka Cape, where it's pretty much cut off and then continues in a relatively stable manner southwards until the very south of Gulf of Riga, but at a much more moderate rate. North of Riga, around the point where you can see the box with 100 and to the south of it, there are several points of reversals of sediment transport, interconnected sedimentary systems that have been previously described in some literature that I have listed, which generally gives a good idea that, yes, the model should be doing something right in that location. And the last aspect of it is that the Pärnu Bay, while it experiences some accumulation and they have a need for harbor dredging, Based on sediment availability along the coastline itself, that is not the main source of the need to dredge, but it's more associated with the river Parnu inflow, the position of sedimentary material in that area. And while for a technical view to the west of Parnu to see that the longest waves will come from the opening of Irbe Strait and essentially split around the headline to create the potential sediment transport cells in that area, the availability of the sediment makes that calculation rather unnecessary, so it's included this time as an anecdotal element. And concluding remarks and future goals. In this research that is still currently ongoing, there is reasonable agreement in magnitude and directional components of the transport, and the higher resolution reveals certain aspects that have been previously described or studied with enhanced clarity. Now, when it comes to the future goals that I'll probably go back to working on this weekend, is refining the results, as there are still several areas of improvement in terms of model quality and picking the better associated points or enhancing the correct angle of the coastline that will reflect the reality a bit better after those are included, and extending the methodology further along the coastlines of Latvia, Lithuania, and potentially going to incorporate the full range of that previous study until Sambian Peninsula. And if I don't burn out completely by that point, I'll continue also along the Polish coastline. And that pretty much summarizes it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mikolaj. Any questions? Yes, please, that's behind.
Thank you very much for the presentation also. So thank you, Maris, if it's correct, for the presentation. Just curious about the in situ measurements. How did you measure? And since it covers a really large area, and how much confidence you have in the measurements, or like the uncertainty in the measurements?
When it comes to the in situ measurements, there was the plan where we have taken some equipment, I believe deployed, I don't quite remember if it was Latvian or Lithuanian coastline. But the problem with taking the in situ measurements for sediment transport tends to be that once deployed, a storm comes along and then it buried everything under like 3 meters of sand. And we stopped getting data for in situ measurements. But when it comes to most of this analysis, it's essentially calculating the potential and then checking in literature to compare against the modeled rates or observed rates in previous studies. But it didn't incorporate for this larger area any sort of new in situ data.
Right, so it's not the aero scanning or anything?
Didn't use so far, might, because it would be useful, but I haven't yet.
Right, I understand the measurement equipment getting swallowed by sediment, that could happen. But thank you very much for the good presentation.
Okay. Any more questions?
Yes, thanks for fascinating presentation, this and the previous ones. So there's a lot to think about. My understanding of these coastal processes is that there are two types of sediment transport. One is alongshore, what is perfectly described in the models that have been presented now, but an important component is also a cross-shore transport, and the big storms, and this is when the main erosion occurs, and the sediments and sands are really taken offshore several kilometers, and then during the low storm or during the times when there is not much of the storms, the sediments are gradually moved back towards the shores, and then when the equilibrium is restored until the next storm takes sands offshore as well. So how do you account for this onshore-offshore transport in your longshore transport models? Is this somehow counted, or do I talk about something else?
I have it essentially planned as a future aspect for adding to the model, because at the moment this is essentially a Eulerian system looking whether stuff moves to the left or to the right along the coastline. When it comes to incorporating further information with the cross-stroke component, I plan to start working on, for example, looking at the Irbe Strait and Kolka Cape area, and based on the wave resolution and the potential transport that I have there, to set up a Lagrangian domain and see where exactly the sediment is drifting off northwards, for example, from Kolka Cape, or how much is going exactly eastwards, and where it is more likely to end up as a deposition area in there. So that is an ongoing aspect. For this, it's focusing essentially on giving better insight on the previous study to give the potential of longshore one.
Yeah, I think that would really strengthen your models, because it's very likely that this longshore transport is happening actually in zigzags.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Anything more?
I can escape.
Thank you. Yes, you have done your part, yes.